The morning sunlight barely filtered through the small window of apartment 3B, as Lynn quietly closed the weathered piano lid. She had been up since 4:30 a.m., practicing on the old upright piano she'd rescued from a second-hand shop 5 years ago. The neighbors didn't mind her playing in the early hours. Most were already heading to their first jobs of the day anyway. In this part of the city, everyone understood the rhythm of hard work. Lynn smoothed down her uniform, a simple gray outfit with the words Grand Palace Hotel stitched above the pocket, and checked her reflection in the bathroom mirror. At 53, her face showed the gentle lines of someone who smiled often despite life's challenges. Her hair, mostly black with elegant streaks of silver at the temples, was pulled back in a practical bun. Nothing about her appearance hinted at the talent in her fingers or the music that lived in her heart. She tucked a small photo into her bag, her grandmother standing proudly next to an old piano in their tiny hometown apartment halfway across the world. Lynn's journey with music had begun there, with an elderly woman's patient guidance and stories of how music could transport you beyond your circumstances. A seed grows wherever it's planted, her grandmother would say, but with music you can bloom anywhere. The bus ride to the hotel took 40 minutes. Lynn used this time to listen to classical recordings on her old MP3 player, a birthday gift from her son who now lived 3 states away with his own family. Today she lost herself in Chopin's nocturnes, her fingers subtly moving against her knee as if playing along. The Grand Palace Hotel stood like a gleaming monument to luxury in the center of the city. Its polished marble entrance, massive crystal chandeliers, and uniformed doormen created an atmosphere of exclusivity that made most ordinary people feel out of place. But not Lynn. After 15 years of cleaning its corridors and rooms, she had developed an invisibility that was almost a superpower. "Morning, Lynn," called out Hank, the aging security guard who always saved part of his lunch for her. He was one of the few who truly saw her. "Good morning," she replied with a warm smile. "Is your knee feeling better today?" "Getting there. My daughter finally convinced me to see that doctor you recommended." He lowered his voice. "Big day coming up, huh?" "The whole place is buzzing about that charity thing." Lynn nodded. "The Arts Education Gala. I've been told to make sure every surface in the ballroom shines like a mirror." "Well, if anyone can do it." "You can," Hank said with genuine admiration. The employee entrance led to a narrow hallway where Lynn clocked in and stored her personal belongings in a small locker. The staff room was already filled with the housekeeping team getting their assignments for the day. "Lynn, you're with me," called out Betty, the head of housekeeping. "They want experienced hands on the ballroom prep. Apparently, half the city's millionaires will be there tomorrow night, donating money so other people's kids can learn music and art." There was no bitterness in Betty's voice, just the matter-of-factness of someone who had long accepted her place in the world. The grand ballroom was the hotel's crown jewel, a vast space with 20-foot ceilings, ornate moldings, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city park. Today it bustled with activity as event staff arranged tables, florists created elaborate centerpieces, and technicians tested sound equipment. At the center of it all stood a magnificent grand piano. It was a Steinway concert grand in gleaming black, positioned on a slightly raised platform where tomorrow's hired musician would perform as guests, sipped champagne and wrote checks for children who, like Lynn had once been, were hungry to learn but lacked the means. "That piano's been giving them headaches," Betty whispered as they began dusting the elaborate crown molding. "Heard the maintenance guys saying some of the keys stick and the pedals make an awful noise. They've been meaning to get it properly serviced for months, but you know how management is. All show, no follow-through." Lynn's eyes kept drifting to the instrument as she worked. During her years at the hotel, she had never once touched it, though she had often imagined what it would feel like to play something so fine. Her own piano at home was decent but showing its age, nothing compared to this masterpiece, even with its hidden flaws. As the day progressed, Lynn moved methodically through her tasks, polishing brass fixtures, ensuring not a speck of dust remained on any surface, carefully cleaning each crystal pendant on the chandeliers. The work was physically demanding, but she took pride in doing it well. There was dignity in making something beautiful, even if few would ever notice who had done it. During her lunch break, Lynn found a quiet corner in the staff room and unwrapped the simple sandwich she'd prepared that morning. Most of the cleaning staff ate quickly before returning to work, but Lynn always took her full 30 minutes. It was a small act of self-respect in a job where it was easy to feel rushed and overlooked. "Hey, did you hear about the pianist?" asked Miguel, a young waiter who often shared the break room with the cleaning staff. "Apparently he's down with some terrible flu. Management's in a panic trying to find a replacement for tomorrow." "They'll find someone," replied another staff member. "They always do. This city is full of musicians desperate for paying gigs." Lynn listened quietly, wondering about the pianist who was too sick to perform. Was he disappointed to miss the opportunity? Did he have family depending on his income? These were the things she often thought about, the stories behind the faces that passed through the hotel. After lunch, Lynn was assigned to clean the corridor leading to the executive offices. It was there that she overheard a conversation that made her pause in her work. "We need to find someone by tomorrow afternoon at the latest," said a man's voice. "Mr. Wilson, the event coordinator. The donors are expecting live music during the reception." "What about that jazz trio that played for the New Year's event?" suggested another voice, already checked. "They're booked solid this month." There was frustration in Mr. Wilson's tone, and every decent pianist in the city seems to be either busy or charging emergency rates we can't justify. Lynn continued her work, moving her cleaning cart down the hall as their voices faded. Music had always been her private joy, something she shared only with family or in the solitude of her apartment. The thought of playing for others, especially in a place like this, had never seriously crossed her mind. That evening, as Lynn completed her shift and gathered her things, she took a detour through the now empty ballroom. The space felt different without the bustle of preparation, peaceful and almost magical in the dim lighting. The piano sat in silence, waiting for tomorrow's performance. Lynn glanced around, confirming she was alone. Then, with a racing heart, she approached the magnificent instrument. She didn't sit. That would have felt too presumptuous. But she allowed her fingertips to lightly touch the smooth fallboard covering the keys. Even this small contact with such a fine piano sent a thrill through her. "It's just us now," she whispered to the piano. "I bet you have so many stories to tell." For a brief moment, Lynn imagined what it would be like to play this instrument, to release the music that lived inside her on something so finely crafted. But such thoughts were fantasies, and Lynn had always been practical above all else. She withdrew her hand and stepped back, returning to the reality of her life. As she left the hotel through the staff exit, Lynn nodded goodbye to the night security guard and stepped into the evening air. Tomorrow would be another long day of preparation, followed by hours of standing ready to clean up spills or address any issues during the gala itself. She would be in the background, as always, watching the city's elite enjoy the beautiful environment that workers like her maintained. Yet as Lynn boarded the bus home, her mind was filled not with thoughts of tomorrow's work but with music. Chopin's nocturnes, Beethoven's sonatas, and even some of her grandmother's folk songs. In her mind's ear, they all played on that magnificent Steinway, with its rich bass and singing treble. And in her imagination, just for tonight, it was her hands bringing those sounds to life. The day of the charity gala arrived with a flurry of activity at the Grand Palace Hotel. Lynn had been called in 4 hours earlier than her usual shift. Arriving at the hotel when the sky was still dark and the streets nearly empty, the management wanted every inch of the ballroom and surrounding areas to be perfect before the first guests arrived that evening. Lynn, check the ladies' restrooms near the ballroom every 30 minutes once the event starts, Betty instructed as they organized cleaning supplies. And make sure you wear the formal uniform, the black one with the hotel crest. Management wants all staff visible during the gala to look extra polished. The formal uniform was rarely used by the cleaning staff, only for the most prestigious events when they might be seen by important guests. Lynn nodded, taking the freshly pressed outfit from the rack in the staff room. Unlike her regular gray uniform, this one almost made her look like part of the hotel's refined atmosphere rather than someone who maintained it. By mid-afternoon, the ballroom had transformed from an empty hall to a glittering showcase of wealth and elegance. Tables draped in cream-colored linen held centerpieces of orchids and roses. The lighting had been adjusted to create a warm glow that made everything and everyone look more beautiful than they were in daylight. Catering staff rushed about setting up serving stations, while event coordinators checked and rechecked their lists. Lynn moved carefully around the edges of the room, touching up spots that others might miss, a fingerprint on a mirror, a bit of dust on a windowsill, a smudge on one of the gold-framed paintings. Years of experience had taught her where to look for imperfections. "Has anyone heard from Maxwell yet?" Mr. Wilson, the event coordinator, hurried into the room with his phone pressed to his ear. The worry lines on his forehead had deepened since yesterday. "We need to know if he found a replacement pianist. The reception starts in 3 hours." His assistant, a young woman named Tina, who always treated the cleaning staff with unusual kindness, followed close behind. "I've left 3 messages. Nothing yet. But I did call the music school downtown. They're checking if any of their teachers are available last minute." Mr. Wilson ran a hand through his thinning hair. "This is a disaster. Half these donors are here specifically because of the music program we're funding. How does it look if we can't even provide music at our own event?" Lynn kept her head down, focusing on her work while listening to their conversation. The grand piano stood prominently on its small platform, polished to a mirror shined by the maintenance team that morning. It looked magnificent. No one would guess that certain keys stuck or that the pedals sometimes squeaked. As the afternoon progressed, Lynn noticed a new tension in the air. The hotel's general manager, Mr. Reynolds, had arrived. Known for his impatience and dismissive attitude toward staff, everyone worked harder and spoke less when he was around. He was deep in conversation with Mr. Wilson near the entrance to the ballroom, his voice carrying across the space despite his attempt to speak quietly. "You're telling me that with less than 2 hours until guests arrive, we have no musician for a gala supporting arts education?" Mr. Reynolds's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is exactly the kind of incompetence I won't tolerate, Wilson. Fix it. I don't care how." Lynn finished wiping down the last mirror and gathered her supplies, hoping to slip out unnoticed before she got caught in the crossfire of management's panic. She had nearly made it to the service door when Tina spotted her. "Lynn!" "Perfect timing," Tina called out, waving her over. "We need some fresh towels for the restrooms before the event. Could you bring some up right away?" "Of course," Lynn replied with a nod. It wasn't her usual task. The housekeeping department typically handled that, but it wasn't unusual to be asked to help with whatever was most urgent. When Lynn returned, 20 minutes later with a cart of fresh towels, the tension in the ballroom had reached new heights. Mr. Reynolds was now pacing near the piano, while Mr. Wilson and several other staff members huddled nearby, looking increasingly desperate. "What about that pianist from the hotel across town? Have we called him?" Mr. Reynolds demanded. "He's booked for a wedding," Mr. Wilson replied, his voice strained. "We've called everyone on our contact list. At this point, we'd need to pay triple the usual rate to get someone here on such short notice, and there's no guarantee they'd be any good." "Then what do you suggest? That we tell our donors we couldn't manage to find a single pianist in a city of 2 million people?" Mr. Reynolds snapped. As Lynn quietly wheeled her cart of towels toward the restrooms, Mr. Reynolds suddenly turned his attention to her. Something in his expression changed, a dangerous glint appeared in his eyes. "You. Wait." He pointed directly at Lynn. "You're one of the longtime cleaning staff, aren't you?" Lynn stopped, her heart beginning to beat faster. In 15 years, the general manager had never addressed her directly. "Yes, sir. 15 years next month." Mr. Reynolds looked her up and down, then turned to Mr. Wilson with a strange smile. "Didn't you tell me once that some of our staff have hidden talents? That one of the cleaning women used to play piano or something?" Mr. Wilson looked confused. I'm not sure I recall. No, I'm certain of it," Mr. Reynolds insisted, warming to whatever idea had struck him. "One of our international staff. From China or Korea or somewhere." He turned back to Lynn. "That's you, isn't it? You play piano?" Lynn felt her throat go dry. She had never mentioned her piano playing to anyone at work except perhaps Hank, the security guard. And she certainly hadn't told any managers about it. Mr. Reynolds had clearly confused her with someone else or was making an assumption based solely on her appearance. Before she could respond, Mr. Reynolds continued. "Listen, what's your name?" "Lynn, sir." "Listen, Lynn, we have a situation here. Our pianist canceled, and we need someone to play during the reception. Just some light background music while people arrive and mingle." He gestured toward the grand piano. Nothing complicated. Just basic tunes that anyone with a bit of training could handle. Tina looked alarmed. "Mr. Reynolds, I don't think it's perfect," he continued, ignoring her. "Our guests will love it. One of our own staff members contributing to the arts education cause. a living example of what we're trying to support. Lynn realized with growing discomfort that this wasn't a genuine request based on knowledge of her abilities. This was something else entirely. The amused glances between some of the junior managers confirmed her suspicion. They thought this was funny, the idea of a cleaning woman trying to play a concert grand piano at a high society event. "The piano has been having some issues," Mr. Reynolds added with a dismissive wave. "Nothing serious, just a few sticky keys. But I'm sure you can work around that, can't you? Just avoid the bad notes." A few of the younger staff members were now struggling to maintain their professional expressions. One turned away, shoulders shaking slightly with suppressed laughter. Lynn felt a flush of embarrassment rising from her neck to her cheeks. In that moment, she understood perfectly. She wasn't being asked to help. She was being set up as entertainment of a different kind. The joke wasn't just that she, a cleaner, would be playing for the city's elite. It was that they expected her to fail spectacularly on a partially broken instrument. "I'm not sure that's appropriate," Tina said quietly, the only one who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. "Nonsense," Mr. Reynolds replied. "It's just until the string quartet arrives for dinner. An hour at most." He turned to Lynn with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What do you say? Help us out of a tight spot?" "The hotel would be very grateful." Lynn looked at the gleaming piano, then at the expectant faces around her. Some curious, some amused, some uncomfortable. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that music was something precious that lived inside you. Not a joke to be shared. She thought about the 15 years she had spent being invisible in these halls, doing her job with quiet dignity, while being overlooked by people like Mr. Reynolds. She could say no. She could explain that there had been a misunderstanding, that she wasn't the person they were thinking of. She could return to her cart and continue with her assigned tasks, avoiding the humiliation they had planned for her. But as she stood there, something else stirred inside her, a feeling that had been dormant for many years. Pride, not the arrogant kind that Mr. Reynolds displayed, but the quiet dignity her grandmother had instilled in her, the kind that said, "I know who I am and what I can do even if you don't." "What time would you like me to play?" Lynn asked, her voice steadier than she expected. Mr. Reynolds looked momentarily surprised, then pleased with himself. 6 o'clock. When the first guests arrive, he turned to Tina. "Find her something appropriate to wear. Can't have her at the piano in a cleaning uniform, can we?" As they walked away, Lynn heard one of the junior managers whisper, "This should be entertaining at least. Better than no music at all." Lynn stood alone beside her cart of towels, her heart pounding in her chest. What had she just agreed to? Was she really going to sit down at that magnificent piano and play for a room full of wealthy strangers who were expecting to laugh at her? The answer came to her not in words but in music, the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major playing in her mind, just as they had almost every morning for the past 30 years. That piece had been her grandmother's favorite. Lynn straightened her shoulders and continued toward the restrooms with her cart. She had 2 hours to prepare for the most important performance of her life. In a small storage room that had been temporarily converted into a changing area, Lynn stared at her reflection in a dusty mirror propped against the wall. Tina had found her a simple black dress from the hotel's Lost and Found, unclaimed for over 6 months and therefore fair game, according to hotel policy. It was slightly too large, but Tina had pinned it in a few strategic places to make it presentable. "I'm sorry about all this," Tina said quietly as she helped Lynn with the final adjustments. "Mr. Reynolds can be difficult." Lynn smoothed down the unfamiliar fabric. The dress was plain but elegant, far nicer than anything she owned. "It's okay. I know what he's doing." Tina looked up, her eyes meeting Lynn's in the mirror. "You do?" "He thinks it will be funny. The cleaning lady trying to play a fancy piano." Lynn's voice remained calm, betraying none of the nervous energy coursing through her body. "They all expect me to embarrass myself." "You don't have to do this," Tina said. "I could tell him you're not feeling well, or that you've never actually played before." Lynn turned to face the younger woman. "But I have played before. For most of my life, actually." Tina's eyes widened slightly. "You mean you really do play the piano?" "My grandmother taught me when I was 5. I've played ever since." Lynn smiled at Tina's surprise. "Not professionally, of course. Just for myself, for joy." "Do they know that, Mr. Reynolds and the others?" Lynn shook her head. "They never asked. They just assumed. For a moment they stood in silence, the reality of the situation hanging between them. Then Lynn reached for the watch she'd removed while changing. It was a simple timepiece with a worn leather band, a gift from her late husband on their 10th anniversary. "It's almost time," she said, securing the watch around her wrist. "I should get going." Tina reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. "Good luck. I'll be there if you need anything." Lynn made her way through the back corridors of the hotel, taking the service elevator to avoid being seen by early arriving guests. Her mind was surprisingly clear now that the decision had been made. Years of morning practice sessions before dawn had taught her how to focus despite distractions. She thought about her tiny apartment with its second-hand upright piano. How many hours had she spent at those keys, finding solace and beauty after long shifts of cleaning other people's messes? Music had always been her private sanctuary, a place where she wasn't defined by her job or her circumstances. And now, because of a cruel joke, she would share that most personal part of herself with strangers who saw her as nothing more than part of the hotel fixtures. As she approached the ballroom, Lynn could hear the growing murmur of voices. The first guests had arrived, wealthy donors in expensive clothes gathering for cocktails before the formal dinner and speeches would begin. Through the service entrance, she could see staff circulating with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The grand piano stood waiting on its small platform, lid raised to project the sound. From this angle, it looked even more impressive than before, a magnificent instrument meant for skilled hands. Lynn felt a momentary wave of doubt. Her own piano at home was nothing compared to this Steinway grand. What if she couldn't adjust to the difference? What if the broken keys were worse than Mr. Reynolds had implied? "Ah, there you are." Mr. Wilson appeared beside her, looking harried but slightly relieved to see her. "Almost everyone on the guest list is here already. We should get you started soon." He led her toward the piano, weaving between guests who barely glanced at them. Lynn caught sight of Mr. Reynolds standing with a group of well-dressed men and women, gesturing in her direction with a subtle smirk. One of the men glanced over, raising an eyebrow as he assessed Lynn. She heard a fragment of Mr. Reynolds' explanation. "Found her cleaning the restrooms." If you can believe it, Lynn kept her eyes forward, focusing on the piano ahead. She would not let them see her discomfort. "Just play whatever you know," Mr. Wilson said as they reached the platform. "Background music, nothing too complex. The real musicians will arrive at 7. He checked his watch nervously. "Can you start now?" Lynn nodded, suddenly unable to speak. The reality of what she was about to do hit her all at once. She hadn't played for an audience since her grandmother's funeral 20 years ago, and she had never played on an instrument of this caliber, broken or not. As Mr. Wilson walked away, Lynn stood alone beside the gleaming piano. The ambient noise of the gathering continued around her. Polite laughter, the clink of glasses, snippets of conversation about investments and vacation homes. No one was paying attention to her yet. She still had a moment to gather herself. Lynn thought about turning around, walking back through the service door and returning to her cleaning cart. It would be so easy. Mr. Reynolds would be annoyed, but by tomorrow it would be forgotten. Just another small failure in the grand scheme of things. She would go back to being invisible and everything would continue as before. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the memory of her grandmother saying, "Music isn't just for those who can afford lessons. It belongs to anyone who feels it in their soul." Or perhaps it was thinking about the children who would benefit from tonight's fundraising, children who deserved the chance she never had to study music properly. Or maybe it was simply that, after 15 years of blending into the background, Lynn was tired of being invisible. She took a deep breath and sat down on the bench. The seat was higher than she was used to, the keys wider and with more resistance. She adjusted her position slightly, finding a comfortable distance from the keyboard. Lynn became aware of a subtle shift in the room. A few people nearby had noticed her at the piano. She saw curiosity in some faces, amusement in others. Near the bar, she spotted Mr. Reynolds watching with several of his colleagues, their expressions revealing their expectations of imminent entertainment, though not the kind the event planners had intended. For a moment, Lynn hesitated, her fingers hovering above the keys. What if they were right? What if she embarrassed herself? What if the broken piano made even her best playing sound amateur? Then she remembered something her grandmother had told her long ago. When you play, don't think about who might be listening. Play for yourself, for the music, for the joy of it. Lynn closed her eyes and took another deep breath. The noise of the room faded away. In her mind, she was back in her grandmother's small apartment, learning to play on an old upright with chipped keys and uneven pedals. She placed her fingers on the keyboard and began to play the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The first few notes were tentative as she tested the instrument's response. As promised, several keys were indeed sticky, requiring more pressure than others. The pedal made a slight squeaking sound when depressed, but beneath these flaws, the piano's inherent quality revealed itself. Even with its problems, it was magnificent, responsive in ways her home piano could never be, with a depth of tone that seemed to resonate in her very bones. Lynn adjusted her touch, adapting to the instrument's quirks. She pressed harder on the sticky keys, eased up on the ones that rang too loudly, found a way to use the pedal that minimized the squeak. It was like having a conversation with a difficult but brilliant partner, finding a way to dance together despite the obstacles. As she continued playing, Lynn gradually opened her eyes. The first thing she noticed was the silence. The chatter and laughter had dimmed. People near the piano had stopped their conversations. Glasses paused halfway to lips as they turned to look at her. She saw surprise on their faces, not the mocking amusement she had expected, but genuine surprise. A woman in a blue dress stood transfixed, her champagne forgotten. An older man with silver hair had turned completely away from his companions to watch Lynn's hands moving across the keys. Even Mr. Reynolds looked taken aback, his smug smile fading as he realized that the joke he had orchestrated was not unfolding as planned. Lynn felt a strange calm settle over her. The piano's flaws no longer seemed important. The audience's reaction no longer mattered. There was only the music, the beautiful, flowing melody that had comforted her through so many difficult times in her life. As she moved deeper into the piece, Lynn allowed herself to play not just with technical correctness, but with emotion. Her fingers danced across the keys with increasing confidence, coaxing beauty from the flawed instrument as if it had been waiting all along for the right touch. The sticky keys became opportunities to linger on certain notes, adding subtle emphasis. The uneven action became a way to create unexpected dynamics. Even the squeaky pedal seemed to add character rather than detract from the performance. Lynn was no longer a cleaning woman playing a broken piano as a joke. She was simply a musician, sharing the music she loved with people who were beginning to truly listen. The ballroom grew quieter with each passing moment as Lynn's fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence. The Chopin Nocturne flowed through the space, its gentle melancholy touching something deep in those who listened. People who had been mid-conversation turned fully toward the piano. Waiters paused with their trays, momentarily forgetting their duties. Lynn felt the change in the room but kept her focus on the music. The grand piano responded to her touch in ways her old upright at home never could, revealing colors and textures in the familiar piece she had never fully experienced before. Despite its flaws, the occasional sticky key, the slightly uneven action, the instrument's true voice emerged under her careful hands. As she reached the middle section of the piece, where the melody grows more complex and emotionally intense, Lynn closed her eyes again. In her mind, she was no longer in the Grand Palace Hotel surrounded by wealthy strangers. She was back in her grandmother's apartment, learning this very piece as a young girl. She could almost smell the jasmine tea her grandmother always prepared before their lessons and feel the gentle corrections as aged hands guided her own. Music is a language that needs no translation, her grandmother used to say. It speaks directly to the heart. Now, decades later, Lynn finally understood the full meaning of those words. The music was speaking through her, crossing all the boundaries of position and privilege that separated her from the guests in this room. Near the bar, Mr. Reynolds stood frozen, his drink halfway to his lips. The smug amusement that had been on his face earlier had transformed into bewilderment. This was not what he had expected, not the fumbling, embarrassing display that would have provided an amusing anecdote to share with colleagues later. Instead, he was witnessing something extraordinary. A distinguished older gentleman with a neatly trimmed white beard made his way closer to the piano, his eyes never leaving Lynn's hands. He stood at the edge of the small platform, watching with an intensity that might have unnerved Lynn had she noticed him. But she remained lost in the music, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm, her face reflecting the changing emotions of the piece. The hotel owner, Mr. Chen, arrived with his wife and a group of important donors just as Lin was approaching the final section of the nocturne. They paused at the entrance, surprised by the unusual quiet that had fallen over what was typically a noisy cocktail hour. "What's happening?" Mrs. Chen whispered to her husband. "I'm not sure," he replied, scanning the room until his eyes landed on the piano. "That's not the pianist we hired." As the final notes of the nocturne faded into silence, Lin opened her eyes, momentarily disoriented by the spell that had fallen over the room. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved or spoke. Then, as if released from a trance, the audience erupted into applause, hesitant at first, then growing in enthusiasm until it filled the ballroom. Lin's cheeks flushed with heat. She hadn't expected applause. She hadn't expected anyone to really listen at all. She had prepared herself for polite indifference at best, mockery at worst. The genuine appreciation radiating from the crowd caught her completely off guard. She glanced around, taking in the sea of surprised and delighted faces. Near the bar, she saw Mr. Reynolds looking utterly confounded, as if someone had just told him the earth was flat. Tina stood near a service door, a wide smile on her face. And directly in front of the piano, the white-bearded gentleman was watching her with a curious intensity. Lin didn't know what to do next. She had only planned to play the one piece. The nocturne that was so familiar she could play it even with shaking hands on an unfamiliar piano. But the audience clearly expected more. She saw people moving closer to the piano, gathering around to listen properly rather than treating the music as background to their conversations. Almost without conscious thought, her fingers found the keys again. This time she began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune, another piece she had practiced countless times in the early morning hours before work. Its dreamy, impressionistic quality seemed to fit the moment, the shimmering arpeggios like moonlight dancing on water. As she played, Lin noticed the white-bearded man whispering something to Mr. Chen, who looked at Lin with new interest. She pushed the observation aside, focusing again on the music. The Debussy was more technically challenging than the Chopin, especially on an unfamiliar instrument with quirks she was still discovering. But somehow that made it more engaging. Each note required her full attention, each phrase a new conversation with this magnificent if imperfect piano. By the time she finished the second piece, the crowd had grown even larger. More guests had arrived, and staff members were finding excuses to linger near the ballroom entrance. The applause this time was immediate and enthusiastic. Lin heard someone whisper, "Who is she?" And another respond, "I thought she was just part of the hotel staff." The white-bearded man stepped forward as the applause began to fade. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Lin couldn't quite place. That was quite extraordinary, especially considering the condition of this instrument. He gestured toward the piano with a knowing smile. "I'm Professor Andrei Volkov from the City Conservatory of Music." Lin felt her heart skip a beat. The City Conservatory was renowned throughout the country, a place where only the most talented musicians studied and taught. And this man was a professor there. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice softer than she intended. "The piano has some challenges." "Indeed it does," Professor Volkov agreed with a slight nod. "Which makes your performance all the more impressive. You've clearly had training?" Before Lin could respond, Mr. Reynolds appeared at the professor's side, his face a mask of professional courtesy that couldn't quite hide his confusion. "Professor Volkov, I see you've met our entertainment for the evening." The professor raised an eyebrow. "Entertainment? This woman is an artist. Where did you find her?" Mr. Reynolds' smile became strained. "Well, actually, she's part of our cleaning staff. She was filling in because our regular pianist fell ill." Professor Volkov's eyes widened slightly as he turned back to Lin. "Is this true? You work as a cleaner here?" Lin straightened her shoulders, feeling a strange mix of pride and defiance. "Yes, for 15 years now." "And where did you study piano?" "At the conservatory." "I never had formal training beyond childhood," Lin replied honestly. "My grandmother taught me when I was young. After that, I taught myself." The professor's expression shifted from surprise to something like wonder. "Self-taught? And you play Chopin and Debussy with such sensitivity?" He shook his head slightly. "That's remarkable." Mr. Chen joined their small circle, his wife beside him. Professor Volkov tells me we've discovered a hidden talent in our midst, he said, looking at Lynn with new respect. How long have you been playing for us without our knowledge? This is my first time at this piano, Lynn explained. I've never played for the hotel before. A oversight we should remedy, Mrs. Chen said warmly, then turned to her husband. Don't you think so, dear? Mr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Indeed. He glanced at Mr. Reynolds, whose discomfort was becoming increasingly evident. Reynolds, why wasn't I informed that we had such talent among our staff? I wasn't aware myself until recently, Mr. Reynolds stammered. It was quite a surprise. A slight smile played at the corners of Lynn's mouth. She suspected Mr. Reynolds wouldn't be sharing the full story of how he had intended to humiliate her, for the amusement of himself and his colleagues. Would you play something else for us? Mrs. Chen asked Lynn. The guests are enchanted. I haven't seen them this attentive in all the years we've hosted this gala. Lynn looked out at the waiting faces of the crowd. Gone was the polite indifference she was accustomed to as hotel staff. Now they were looking at her, truly seeing her perhaps for the first time. Not as someone who cleaned their rooms or polished their surroundings, but as a person with gifts and depth they had never bothered to notice before. I would be honored, she said, turning back to the keyboard. This time, she chose Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, a piece with more fire and intensity than her previous selections. It was challenging, pushing the limits of her self-taught technique. But she had practiced it for years, mastering its difficult rhythms and powerful dynamics. As the dramatic opening chords filled the room, Lynn felt something unlock inside her, a joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes even as her fingers flew over the keys. This moment, this unlikely stage, this audience that had gathered to witness what was supposed to be her humiliation, all of it had somehow transformed into the opportunity she had never dared to dream of. The broken piano beneath her hands no longer seemed broken at all, or perhaps it was, but its brokenness no longer mattered. Under Lynn's touch, it sang with a voice that filled the grand ballroom and touched everyone present with its powerful emotion. In that moment, Lynn understood that she too had been like this piano, outwardly flawed perhaps, overlooked and underestimated, but containing within herself depths and capacities that had simply been waiting for the right moment to be revealed. When the final thunderous chords of the Rachmaninoff Prelude faded into silence, Lynn sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the keys. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the entire ballroom held its breath. Then came the applause, not polite, restrained approval, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation that swelled until it filled every corner of the grand space. Lynn looked up, momentarily stunned by the response. People were standing, their faces alight with something she had never seen directed at her before: admiration. In all her years at the hotel, moving quietly through hallways with her cleaning cart, she had been treated with indifference at best. Now these same people were looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, which in many ways they were. Professor Volkov was the first to approach the piano again, his weathered face alive with excitement. Remarkable, he said, shaking his head in wonder. Absolutely remarkable. You have a rare gift. Thank you, Lynn replied, her voice barely audible above the continued applause. I just love to play. It shows, he said with a knowing smile. Music like that cannot come from technique alone. It comes from the heart. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. I would very much like to speak with you about your future. If you're interested. Lynn stared at the card in his outstretched hand. The words City Conservatory of Music were embossed in elegant gold lettering. My future? She repeated, not quite understanding. Yes. It's never too late to pursue your passion professionally, especially not with talent like yours. Before she could respond, Mr. and Mrs. Chen approached, followed by several well-dressed donors who had been watching her performance with evident delight. That was extraordinary, Mrs. Chen said warmly. Why haven't we heard you play before? Lynn glanced briefly at Mr. Reynolds, who stood uncomfortably at the edge of the gathering. No one ever asked, she said simply. A flicker of understanding passed across Mrs. Chen's face. Well, we're asking now, she turned to her husband. Wouldn't she be perfect for our weekend lobby performances? Mr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. The guests would love it. He looked directly at Lynn. Would you consider playing regularly for us? We could arrange proper compensation, of course. Lynn blinked in surprise. In all her years of working at the hotel, she had never imagined sitting at this piano as anything other than the cleaning woman who polished its surface. I would need to practice more, she said honestly, and learn new pieces. We could arrange practice time, Mr. Chen said, and perhaps lessons if you'd like. I might be able to help with that, Professor Volkov interjected, a twinkle in his eye. If you're serious about developing her talent, absolutely, Mr. Chen replied. This is exactly the kind of thing our arts education initiative should support. Lynn felt overwhelmed by the conversation swirling around her. Just hours ago, she had been stocking towels in the restrooms, invisible to these same people. Now they were discussing her future as if she were a discovered treasure. In a way, she supposed she was. A tall woman in an elegant black dress stepped forward. Lynn recognized her as Dr. Patel, one of the city's most prominent philanthropists and a major donor to the Arts Education Fund. I would very much like to sponsor this woman's studies, she announced. This is precisely why I support this cause, to uncover hidden talent that might otherwise never have the chance to flourish. The murmurs of approval from the surrounding crowd made Lynn's cheeks flush with heat. She wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention, and part of her longed to return to the comfortable anonymity of her cleaning cart. But another part, the part that had played her heart, out on this magnificent piano, recognized that something profound had shifted. A door had opened and she was being invited to walk through it. I don't know what to say, she admitted, looking from face to face. Say yes, Tina called from nearby, her expression one of pure delight. Say yes to all of it. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, warm and encouraging. Lynn found herself smiling in response, the last of her nervousness melting away. Yes, she said finally. Yes, I would like that very much. As the formal part of the evening began and guests moved toward their tables for dinner, Lynn found herself surrounded by people eager to speak with her. Some wanted to know where she had studied. Others asked if she would play at their private events. A few simply wanted to shake her hand and tell her how moved they had been by her music. Through it all, she noticed Mr. Reynolds standing at a distance, watching with an unreadable expression. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and Lynn felt no anger toward him, only a strange sort of gratitude. His attempt to humiliate her had instead given her this unexpected moment of recognition. Later, as the string quartet took over and Lynn prepared to return to her regular duties, she was surprised to find Betty, the head of housekeeping, blocking her path to the service elevator. Where do you think you're going? Betty asked, hands on her hips but a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Back to work, Lynn replied, gesturing to her cleaning cart waiting near the service entrance. I still have the second-floor restrooms to check before my shift ends. Betty shook her head firmly. Not tonight, you don't. Mr. Chen himself just told me you're off duty for the rest of the evening. She nodded toward the ballroom. You're a guest now. But my cart will be taken care of, Betty assured her. Now go back in there and enjoy yourself for once. God knows you've earned it. Lynn hesitated, caught between two worlds. The familiar routine of her cleaning duties and the new, unexpected path that had opened before her. Then, with a small nod of decision, she turned and walked back toward the ballroom. Professor Volkov was waiting for her near one of the ornate columns, a glass of champagne in his hand and another extended toward her. To new beginnings, he said as she accepted it. I'm 53 years old, Lynn said quietly, the reality of her situation suddenly striking her. Isn't that too late to begin something new? The professor's eyes crinkled with amusement. My dear, music doesn't care about your age. It only cares about your heart, your dedication, and your willingness to work. You have all three in abundance. He took a sip of his champagne. Besides, the best musicians never stop being students. We are all beginners in some way. Across the room, Lynn spotted Hank, the security guard who had always been kind to her. Someone had obviously told him about what happened, because he was beaming at her from his post by the door, giving her a discreet thumbs up when he caught her eye. As the evening progressed, Lynn found herself seated at a table with Professor Volkov, Dr. Patel, and several other patrons of the arts. They talked about music, about the conservatory's programs, about possibilities she had never allowed herself to consider. For the first time in her adult life, people were asking about her dreams rather than her duties. Near midnight, as the gala began to wind down, Lynn made her way back to the piano. The ballroom was quieter now, many guests having already departed. The cleaning staff, her colleagues, were beginning the enormous task of returning the space to its usual pristine condition. Lynn sat down on the bench once more, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. This morning she had been just another invisible worker in this grand hotel. Tonight she had been seen, truly seen perhaps for the first time since her grandmother had recognized the music in her soul. She pressed a single key, listening to the pure tone as it resonated through the now quiet ballroom. The piano still had its flaws, the sticky keys, the squeaky pedal, but she no longer heard these as imperfections. They were simply part of this particular instrument's character, its unique voice. "Are you going to play something else?" asked a voice behind her. Lynn turned to find Tina standing nearby, a stack of programs in her arms. "Just one more piece," Lynn said with a smile. "For myself." As Tina moved away to continue her work, Lynn began to play once more. This time she chose a simple folk melody her grandmother had taught her, the first piece she had ever learned. Its uncomplicated beauty filled the emptying ballroom, a gentle conclusion to an extraordinary evening. Tomorrow would bring decisions and changes. There would be conversations about her schedule, about lessons at the conservatory, about a future suddenly rich with possibilities she had never imagined. But tonight, in this moment, there was only the music. The same music that had sustained her through years of pre-dawn practice sessions in her tiny apartment. As the final notes faded away, Lynn closed the fallboard gently over the keys. She stood and looked around the ballroom one last time. The cleaning staff paused briefly in their work, several of them offering smiles or nods of approval, small gestures that meant more to her than all the evening's applause. Lynn smoothed down the borrowed dress and walked toward the service exit, her steps light. Tomorrow she would return to this hotel, not as a shadow moving unnoticed through polished hallways, but as someone who had found her voice at last. And somewhere, she felt certain her grandmother was smiling,